to say a few words, if you'd like to, about Jack and kind of how we all got together. How we ended up here is about 9 months ago. I met Joanne, and Joanne is Jack's wife, and I thought, well, if she likes Jack this much, I probably should see, what he's all about, because Joanne just has great vision for Jacksonville and for Florida, and I was really taken with how engaged these folks were in the community here in Jax. Some things happened both in the national and local political scene that caused my wife and I to realize we were sitting on the sidelines a little too much, and so we got engaged for some specific candidates and found our way to Jack. So I think, Jack's work in Springfield and throughout Jacksonville, throughout his life, speaks for itself. But also, Jack has served.
I want to say you should just use this in a commercial.
Yeah.
She'd be great. She'd be great.
Having visited with Jack,
You together with me.
I was stricken by just kind of how thoughtful he is. But also just the level of the work that he's done and what he's done, but he does it very humbly. And I think one issue that we see in politics right now is a lot of ambition, but maybe not a lot of vision. And I think Jack is here to make a difference for the community and not because he wants something for himself. And so can't say enough nice things about Jack, although I've tried just now.
Oh, you're doing a good job. You're doing a good job.
But if anybody else from our host group who I've loved working with would like to say anything, please feel free. And then Jack's going to talk. This is my daughter, Sandler. And again, one of the reasons that we got involved, we have 2 young children here in Jax, and my wife's born and raised Jacksonville, so we're excited about what Jacksonville can be.
I will just say, we moved here in 2009, and Jack was one of the first people we met, and it was at a community meeting, and then we met Joanne. We were neighbors, so we were neighbors for 11 years. Until
You shouldn't have left us, by the way.
Yeah, I know, we left you. But the things that I love about Jack is, number one, his intelligence. He smart guy. He sees an issue, he delves into it, he dives deep into it, researches it, and like you said, he does it all very humbly. We don't even realize all the stuff that Jack and Joanne do. The other thing is that Jack is, I think, very principled, and I like people that, that compass points north, and they're not all over the place. He has a faith that guides him. He's got that good moral compass. He's got good ethics, etc. And then the last thing, he's got a great sense of humor. The thing that I've enjoyed about Jack is, I'll tell him some story, and Jack will say, "Susan, I got a story for you." So he has some humorous story, but humor also sometimes has that kernel of truth. And so Jack's humor, whether it's a phrase, a story, a word, it seems like there's always that kernel of truth to it. So that's just, some of the many facets that we've come to know you that I really, really love. And I think the city of Jacksonville needs somebody like Jack. I really do. So.
Well, thank you for that. I hear these sorts of remarks, and I always think, well, maybe we should just sing the Hallelujah chorus and go home and eat the food. Obviously, I've had opportunities in this process, to think more about our city and our circumstances, and also think more about myself. 2 years ago, I turned 70, so I'll be 72 next month. So this is not a career move for me. It's too late to start a political dynasty. So I've had to think a lot about how I got here, why am I doing this, what's important to me, what makes this worthwhile. And as I've traveled around our city, we've got this amazingly diverse, and the word I use, sort of rambunctious city. The other day, one day this week, I was over on the north side, pretty far out on Dunn Avenue, at one of these radio stations. I guess you'd call it a black gospel radio station, getting an ad done. And so then I drove from there to Mayport Village, which took the better part of an hour to make that drive. And JR and I, JR's here somewhere, he was giving me a tour of Mayport Village, which I hadn't been there in recent years, but I came here, as we joke about, it's now 50 years ago.
Did you know that Jack Meeks has been in Jacksonville for almost 50 years?
50 years. I've said that 12, 15 times, 20 times, 30 times. Anyway, that area doesn't look a whole lot different than I remember it looking in 1973 or 1974. But the point was, I drove that 45 minutes or an hour, and I'm still in the same city. So there's a lot of diversity in our city, and yet when I've gone around and talked with people and heard what they have to say, there's a lot of commonality. We've done surveys too, in addition to talking with people, and so I'll always hear safety, public safety. That's always at or near the top. And then there are other issues that come up, and one of the things, and this starts intersecting with my background because I've had a CPA financial type background, is transparency. And so that, I imagine if we ask 100 people, what they meant by transparency, we get 100 different answers. Certainly what I found out though, as we hear this thing that love makes the world go round. Well, oftentimes money also makes the world go round. And in this political arena of ours, everything starts with money. And one of the things I'll hear, and I've been in these candidate forums, is we have all these wants. We want better public safety. We want to improve our infrastructure. We want our neighborhoods to be cleaner. We want more social and educational activities, more civic or cultural activities. We have a long list of things that we want, and yet all of it eventually starts with, how do we collect and spend our money? So as I started delving into our finances, and I was really kind of shocked at some of this, that I guess one of the most glaring things is I found out that our city, with a $1.5 billion general fund budget, didn't regularly or timely balance its bank accounts. So that, Pam's work for the city, she's nodding her head, so that we were having transactions that were running through our bank accounts that weren't being recorded timely on our books. And so as I began reading our audited financial statements and asking more questions and talking to people, I asked a question of this lady who recently retired from the city. And I said, well, how do we manage this $1.5+ billion budget when we don't have accurate, timely financial statements? And the lady said, well, we just make numbers up, which wasn't, I thought, a good answer. So people say, what's one of the first things you'd like to do? Well, one of the first things I'd like to do is really see about getting our financial circumstances under control. And I spent several $1,000s with an attorney friend of mine making these public information requests so they would look official. And to say that I got stiffed and didn't get answers to the questions I had would be a compliment to what was given to me. So I'm hopeful that being on the council, I would be able to ask questions and not have people evade me in terms of getting answers to those questions. The other thing that sort of coordinates with this, and let me tell you, I wouldn't be here without Joanne, because I would have never moved to historic Springfield without Joanne, is that in our 1 square mile, we got 2 folks who live there now. I always call her Grandma. Where's Grandma? She's hiding. Who used to live there. That in our 1 square mile, a lot of the problems that we have in Jacksonville are in, or at least can show an example in our 1 square mile. If it's busted up streets or sidewalks, I can show you that. If it's mental health issues, all I got to do is walk outside of our door and see folks with those kinds of issues. If it's cleanliness, I can't go outside of our home anytime and not pick up trash. And so one of the things I say, our city is not a clean city either from a physical standpoint or from a financial standpoint. So those two things have sort of, I think, either coordinated or collided with me of seeing we can certainly do a whole lot better financially than what we're doing, and we can certainly do a whole lot better dealing with our neighborhoods that have been left behind than what we're doing. And I've had experience in both of those. So I'm going to say one more thing, JR. You thought maybe think about this. One more thing, and then I'll open this up to questions. If the questions are too hard, I'll refer them to somebody else. I went to an Ash Wednesday service, and certainly in our Christian faith and tradition, there's a good bit about humility and being open to change and being open to people who are different than we are. And that's, I think, almost always the case, but certainly on Ash Wednesday and during Lent, there's more of a sense of being humble and examining ourselves. And it hadn't occurred to me until I was sitting there in the church, and I thought about what an odd juxtaposition of Lent and what I'm seeing in our political races. And I've seen absolutely the nastiest mailers and commercials in this season of politicking than I've ever seen before in this town. And I thought, these millions of dollars are being spent to do that. That's really not helpful to our city, and it's not addressing the sorts of problems or opportunities that we have in our city. And so one of the things that we've done about our campaign is talk about some of those things, and I'm not going to be going about attacking any of the people who are in my race. Talk about the issues. So enough of that. Let me see if I can answer any questions that you have.
So about the issues, I was looking at your flyer earlier and saw that one of your priorities was reducing homelessness with comprehensive efforts, including mental health initiatives. Obviously, I think that's both homelessness and mental health issues are a big factor in crime in the city, and so I'm wondering, practically on the ground, what is the vision specifically that you have for mental health initiatives that you think, and reducing homelessness, projects that you think could address those problems?
Well, I've got probably more observations than I've got solutions. One of the things when people talk about reducing homelessness, well, one thing to me is let's look at the groups, because they're so vastly different. On one end of the spectrum, we have people with serious mental health problems, and I see them, as I mentioned, every day. On the other end of the spectrum, we have someone who's living paycheck to paycheck. If they miss a paycheck, they're not going to pay their rent, and they're liable to be put out on the streets. So to talk about the mental health a little bit, and these are some more observations. So I'm going to tell you some things I've read. Starting off as a junior grade auditor, I'm going to tell you I haven't audited these. These are things I've read. One, we used to have one mental health bed for every 300 Americans. Now it's one for every 3,000. And we've gone back to doing what we used to do in the 1800s, which is incarcerate the mentally ill. As we close down or substantially reduce the mental health facilities, which were far from perfect. I'm sure if you've read anything about it, it's far from perfect. So there's a real push and pull, and I'm reading articles about what people are trying to do in New York. There's a real push and pull with how far can we go from a legal standpoint to require that people be institutionalized and administered drugs or something versus their right not to have that done. But certainly I see people out on the street who need a lot more help than they're being given. Another issue is sometimes it doesn't make sense to spend more money. But in Jacksonville, and almost anything I've looked at, and I guess starting back about 10 years ago, in the various city positions I had, appointed positions, I started looking at our finances. Almost anything I looked at, we were always on the tail end of spending. So in the mental health arena, the last thing I've seen, Florida, on a per capita basis, is 49th in per capita spending on mental health. The only reason we aren't 50th is Arkansas didn't report, the last thing I saw. And then Duval County, we're either last in the state, or I've heard, well, we're not last in the state, we're only last among the what we call the major cities. So one of the issues has to be we're not spending enough money to deal with the mental health problems that we have. And certainly it's a complicated situation. The feeling I get from talking to council members and administrations in the past is that there really hasn't been much of a serious look at that. That's the impression that I have. So I've probably given you more observations of what I think is wrong than how to cure all those things. But first, I think, is trying to understand the context that we have. And I'm not sure from a city standpoint that we've done a lot of that.
So are you planning on looking at people who've been successful in those sort of things
That's a good idea. Yeah, somebody somewhere must be doing something better than we are.
Because, I mean, there are counties that are looking at those sort of problems and finding interesting solutions that aren't like incarcerate people, finding programs.
And we are doing some of that. I've read some initiatives that we've taken that seem, but some of these things people have been doing effectively for, so I'll read in the papers that we get, for 10 or 20 years, and now it's just coming, it's just coming to Jacksonville. We don't seem to be cutting edge on most anything that we can talk about in terms of adopting best practices more quickly. Pam keeps nodding her head.
No, and I want to, by the way, I totally agree with that. That mental health is a huge issue that I'm concerned about as well. But at the same time, so you know, I worked for the Parks Department for years. We did a study several years ago of park systems that were the same size as Jacksonville, and some examples. In Denver, for tax dollars, for every taxpayer, 121 tax dollars go to the city parks, right? In Minnesota, in Minneapolis, St. Paul area, they have a huge park system. It was like $89. Jacksonville was $18. And the same thing happens with public works. So the two departments that can make the difference with infrastructure and with quality of life, you know, that affect everybody, were getting the least amount of spend. But most of the money went to supposedly JSO, right? And that happened year after year after year. And the same thing with mental health. They wouldn't have supported any. You know, they tried to close the Victims Services Center because they didn't want to pay for us to have women's victim services rights, right? So, what are your thoughts on that as well?
Well, I'll give you my basic thoughts on it. Whatever it is, we're underspending. Even JSO. I've looked at those statistics and talked to people in JSO. We've got, I think it works out to about 1.6 or 1.7 officers per thousand. Supposedly, the national statistics are more 2.3 or 2.4. So I've met with former Sheriff Glover. I guess you probably heard his name. I've met with him several times. He doesn't like for me to cast aspersions on his successors, but I met with I looked at several pages he gave me of things he was most, I guess, proud of that he had initiated. One was community policing. And from what I can tell, that's pretty much gone by the boards. And as I made inquiries about that, you know, the reason was we didn't have enough officers to develop relationships with people in the neighborhoods, and they go from call to call to call. Well, you can't develop relationships like that, and then you don't get the cooperation because there's not the trust level. So we've got real issues now with obtaining, training, and retaining JSO officers and firefighters. So here's at the risk of killing you folks with statistics. We used to have 600 or 700 people on a waiting list for our firefighters. Now it's down to 0. We're not replacing our JSO officers as they retire. It takes over a year to take someone out through the academy and get them to where they can handle a car by themselves. So we're losing experienced officers who are retiring, and we're not bringing in other experienced officers, and even the new people we're bringing in aren't in sufficient numbers. So even though JSO takes up 40% or so of our budget, it's the same thing if we look at in terms of how we spend versus other cities. And then it's further complicated by the fact that we don't have any more for our firefighters or JSO, we don't have what's called a defined benefit pension plan. And so we're not competitive with these other cities who have that. I could go on in that vein, and that doesn't even, I heard when I attended one of the forums when we had the special election for sheriff, you know, both the candidates said that we needed a comprehensive approach to crime. Neither one said exactly what that was, but certainly it includes mental health, It includes appropriate investment in parks and neighborhoods and job opportunities. Businesses aren't going, this is one thing I know something about, having had a 50-year post-college business career. Businesses aren't going to go into neighborhoods where they're not safe enough, where it's not clean enough, where the infrastructure isn't good enough. The risk-reward doesn't work. So we've got a whole host of issues, both on the prevention side and if you actually have to have the JSO officers. It all comes back to, we've tried to run this city on the cheap for decades, and it shows. My wife and I have an old historic home, and we have some other properties. There are two words that I hate together: deferred maintenance. And we've got a city that it just got a raft of deferred maintenance issues. I'm not sure. I probably got carried away with that.
No, that was a great answer.
Well, Jack, obviously we need more money, and Better Jacksonville plan's coming to an end. So do you advocate for continuing that half-cent sales tax into the future?
Well, that's what they're doing anyway. That was what was sold to us some years ago as the fix for the pension plan. And it's, some people would call it a fraudulent fix. Others, at best, a partial fix. So, it seems like I'm talking a lot about numbers. Well, I've had that kind of a career in a fashion. In 2014, I was on the sheriff's just elected, Mike Williams, who managed to move to Nassau County. Any rate, I was on his resource task force in 2014. At that point in time, our unfunded pension balance was about $1.5 billion. Latest numbers I have, and it's gone up since then because the numbers are out of date, it's about $3.1 billion. So it's been going up about $200 million a year. And we weren't supposed to start collecting those sales tax amounts until 2030. I heard the other day from a reliable source it may be 2 or 3 years sooner than that. So not only do we have the problem with what we're spending or not spending in all these issues, we're continuing to create a bigger and bigger unfunded liability in the grandfathered defined benefit pension plan. We have issues. In fact, I talked to one guy who was running for another city council seat, and I was telling him some of these things, and he said, I'm not so sure it's such a smart idea that I'm doing this. So what I hear from these various candidates, whether it's the mayor, I've been to some of their forums, or we won't. Here's what we want. What are we willing to pay for? Now, I would like to have my questions answered about our finances and believe that we had timely, accurate financial statements, that we were collecting what we're supposed to collect, when we're supposed to collect it, and we're only paying what we're supposed to pay when we're supposed to pay it, before I say, give that crowd more money. Because we need to have our arms around what we're doing, and we don't now, in my opinion.
Is it legal to not have financial statements that are visible and transparent?
That's a really good question. So here's where we are. In fact, I don't know if Karen's left or not. There's Karen. Of course she's there. We need to start looking to see if the city has issued their 9/30/22 audit.
Friday,
Not. Okay. So, I started looking at the September 30th, 2020 audited financial statements. And then I got the September 30th, 21. That's the fiscal year end. Mm-hmm. The 22 statements have not been issued. It took 15 months after the end of the fiscal year to issue the 9/30/20 statements. And so we got on a list. It took 12 months for the next year, so there's a modest improvement. We got on a list because the city has a 6-month requirement to issue our audit financial statements, but there's no teeth in it. I thought about proposing legislation, which I bet would never pass, to say that there would be docking of pay of the CFO and some other people in that department if the statements weren't issued timely. The state has a 9-month requirement, but they have a hammer because they can withhold funds from us, and we have a substantial part of our budget that comes from the state. So for 9/30/20, this is a little bit of what I got in my information request, the state had us on this list that if we hadn't had those audited financial statements issued by the end of December of 21, 15 months, then they could have cut off our funds, and we just made it by about 2 weeks.
Wow.
But there didn't seem to be anybody on the council who was going around with their hair on fire. This isn't good. So we were on a list of other towns and cities. No city of our size was on that list. And the one that really got me, because I grew up in Lake City, there's a little town about 20 miles north of Lake City, White Springs. And so White Springs was on that list. And I thought, well, they probably have a part-time bookkeeper. If that person gets sick, they're in real trouble. So we don't need to be on a list of non-performance with White Springs or these other small towns. But anyway, I don't, so yes.
Yeah, so, because, is there transparency into what they're spending the money on?
Well, ultimately,
billions of dollars, what is it just JSO?
Well, no, if you
tactical vehicle.
I mean, if you really want to study the audited financial statements, they're about 400 pages long.
Okay, light reading.
Yeah, and I went through the 930/20 in more detail than I did, and I finally began to get tired with that. And I thought, this is so far out of date, it becomes meaningless. And but I did focus on, particularly in the opening section for both of those two audited years, the CPA has their findings, and they talk about the major issues that the city has. And so I won't go through all of them. One of the other ones, besides not balancing their bank accounts, is the auditors said we had to make numerous significant adjustments to these audited to the city statements to get to the correct numbers in the audited statements. And so I asked for, another thing I didn't get, give me those adjusting entries and the supporting work papers that explain those adjustment entries. And they stiffed me on that, because basically what the auditors are telling me is our books weren't accurate. We had to make a bunch of adjustments, and then I can readily infer that we're running our budget with inaccurate numbers. So I wanted to see, well, what did you have to adjust? I didn't get that information. I think, though, that if I'm on the council, they'll either give it to me or I'll go to the newspaper and raise a ruckus about it.
Jack, I got a question.
It seems to me that there's a lot of money being, you have a budget's spent. In that budget, could you correct me, there's a lot of money given out to corporations, Mr. Khan, we love football, all that. Have you totaled up how many millions of dollars are spent on those, and how carefully that's looked at? It seemed to me that to help the parks, you don't need gazillion millions to do that. I read in the newspaper, 30 million here, 20 million here, 10 million there, to attract these businesses. Have you thought about what you'd like to propose or not, a better use for that money? Or maybe say, okay, you want to come here, but no, we're not going to give you $30 million. All I'm saying is, you say it's about the money. Well, there's money flowing out to a lot of things that aren't taking care of some of these other aspects, like the parks and mental health. Maybe with the mental health money, carving out some of that, you could just do one center, but that's better than is being done now.
Well, one thing I've thought, and this doesn't get down to specific numbers, but one thing I've thought, if our quality of life was better on all these things that we're talking about, we wouldn't have, and this is a bad word to use, we wouldn't have to bribe businesses so much to come here. If our schools were better, if our neighborhoods were cleaner and better, if our parks were better, if we had a handle on our mental health issues, if we weren't sometimes known as the murder capital of Florida, that's not a compliment, I think, then we wouldn't have to do as many of these giveaways that we're doing.
This town is booming, Jack, and it has a great reputation. I know some people look at the underbelly part of it. Every city has the underbelly part. But where would you suggest that we don't spend some of the money? Because you have a budget, they passed the budget, and I'm assuming they're going to spend it. Right? In the budget, we have money to hand out. Do you think we could cut back on some of that to these people coming in and just say, you want to come here, fine. But we have other things to do.
Well, I think there are some possibilities there. I mean, one of the, and again, some of this I only know what I read in the paper, and I haven't drilled down in that 400 pages of audited statements or budgetary numbers to understand all of it. But as an example, over in Brooklyn, we seem to have gotten pretty well past a critical point in Brooklyn, and so I'd be real suspicious about us giving more funds for developers in Brooklyn. as an example. Now, I think in the last 6 months or so, I saw that we were still doing that. I'm more suspicious when we give money for new construction than I am to restore these old buildings. Joanne and I have done that. It's a lot more expensive, and I've got the canceled checks and invoices to show you. It's a lot more expensive to restore these old buildings than it is to build new. So I would be more suspicious about that. I'm more suspicious about giving away our land on the river. Now, once we do that, it's gone. And a good example of a city that's done differently than we have is St. Petersburg. I don't know how many of you have been there, but they've retained a lot of their riverfront, and then the interior streets have really filled in. Some of the other things, and this doesn't totally go to your questions, Gil, but I read what the candidates in the mayor forum had to say about downtown. People want a better downtown. Well, some of the input though to make it that way requires change. Some of it requires money. As an example, we filled up downtown with homeless facilities. That's tough. Makes it tougher. One of the things, I know this is sort of probably overstated, but I think one-way streets are the work of the devil. We talked, when I was on the DIA, we talked about, this has been going back 6 or 8 years ago, about doing away with one-way streets. Hasn't happened. We built a jail, a block off the river from people come to Jacksonville, and they say, what's that building with the small windows? They're amazed. They're amazed it's a jail.